Good evening, everyone.
Good evening, sir.
Evening, sir.
Hi, sir.
Okay, I'll just set up my deck while we're waiting for the others.
Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon, good evening. Yeah, let's wait for one more minute. I hope the others show up. Well,
Good evening, sir.
good evening. Sige, at 6:02, I think we can start. No, I think the others will join in a while. Okay. Can someone confirm that you can see my screen and hear me properly?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
All right, great. Thanks. No. Again, like as I announced before, no, you can. I would prefer that you guys switch on your cameras, but if you're not able to, that's fine. It's not required. Para lang mukhang I'm not talking to the computer. It's hard sometimes, you know. All right. So again, thank you for your understanding, and thanks for letting me know, no, through your bid that some were having connectivity issues last week because of Julina. So I'm now merging the last part of module 1 with the first part of module 2. No? So, but they're both short anyway. No? So we'll still finish in an hour and a half, no? Or maybe less. We'll see. It depends. No? If we have a lot of questions as well. No? So even if I merge them, it's still not going to take super long. So bear with me. Maybe we'll end around 7:30ish. All right. So again, any time you have a question or you want to say something, just let me know, raise your hand or type something in the chat box. I usually start the synchronous session with announcements. No? So assume this was asked by the other class yesterday. No? Sir, you've been quiet, no? Or do we have class? Well, if I'm quiet, assume we have class. No? So I wrote that down in the syllabus. You might have missed it, but assume there is synchronous class every Wednesday at 6 p.m. except on holidays or like last week, if I announced something or otherwise. So, yeah. Module 2 has been uploaded. I'm sure most of you have seen that. The guidelines for the instructions for your first individual major assignment has been posted at the end of Module 2. So you can see that there, no? Instruction, it's due on October 2, 11:59 p.m. That's an individual assignment. No? It's just 2 pages. No? So it's simple enough. No? But it will gauge your understanding or your understanding of modules 1 and 2. The final integrated outputs will be circulated soon. This will be announced by your NSTP formator, si Ms. Brando, if I'm not mistaken. So I'm coordinating with Opman and NSTP teachers for groupings. I think you guys have already chosen your groups. No? It's anchored on both your Opman and area assignments. Because your FIO will be anchored on the Opman groupings. So if you don't, I don't believe this is applicable to this class. No? If you don't have both Opman and NSTP this semester, please let me know as soon as possible. In my other class, there was a fourth year regular student. No? So that person already took, that student took Opman already. So he just has to choose his own group. Questions, concerns on this? Before we move to the topics? Okay. All right. So module 1, we'll just cover a few things. So we took off from before, no, from module 1, we took off from sustainable development. We'll revisit that and talk about a global set of goals, no, called the Sustainable Development Goals. And since you guys are management students, I wanted to spend some time also on just discussing what you think or what we think the private sector could do for development. Kasi in many ways, no, usually when we think of development, gobyerno yan or NGOs yan. But I would make the argument, no, it's everyone has a role to play, especially the private sector, who in many ways is well endowed with resources, no? Not just financial, but other kinds of resources. Then we also want to, speaking of COVID, what are some of the development impacts? And I wanted to just provide a recap, no, of the last video of module 1. So I want this session to be more interactive. I will be asking a few questions. If some of you can participate, that would be appreciated. All right, so talking about the sustainable development goals. Before I do that, I would like to put into context the SDGs. No? There was a set of goals that was the precursor to the SDGs. No? These were the MDGs, Millennium Development Goals. The reason why it's Millennium because it was agreed upon in 2000, year 2000, 21 years ago, my graduation year. So it had 8 goals, no, and 18 indicators. More simple, very simple. So ending poverty and hunger, education, mortality, improving maternal health as well, combating diseases, ensuring environmental sustainability. And the 8 is not really a goal, but more like a call, especially to developed countries, to share more to the poorer ones in terms of resources and expertise. So this was the precursor. No? So UN countries agreed in 2000 to achieve certain goals by 2015. That was the original goalpost. Actually, they are not all of them are new goals. Some were just sort of a rehash of previous goals. Kasi the UN kasi periodically, they set goals. No? So even in the early 90s, meron yan on sustainable development, etc. etc. So as you know now, no, you guys are more conscious about this. In the early 2000s and even especially up to now, no, the concept of sustainable development became more prominent. Kasi dati development lang. Ngayon, parang, with the advent of Al Gore, the inconvenient truth, it became more pronounced. No? The importance of, we had this slide last time, no? The importance of sustainable development, which as we discussed last time, it's development that meets the needs of the present, no, without compromising the ability of future. So basically, it's being cognizant of the future. So in many cases, no, but not completely. In many cases, this has been synonymous with the environment. So the MDGs were that 2015. Now they were talking. So ano na? What happens after 2015? So come 2015, they decided, oh, let's be more ambitious. Let's come up with broader goals. No, let's update it. Let's have more ambitious targets. So the 8 goals now became 17 goals. To be fair to other countries, they actually met. Many countries met some of the goals, no, or even exceeded. No? So even poverty, no, having poverty, for example, was achieved by some countries in a 15-year gap, no, time horizon. So yun. And the reason why it's called Sustainable Development Goals, if you compare this with this one, ito isa lang, no? There's only one goal that specifically talks about sustainable development. But the new set of goals that was agreed upon in 2015, or I think 2016, is peppered, no, with a lot of aspects of sustainable development. So for example, affordable and clean energy, sustainable cities, responsible consumption and production, climate action, biodiversity in the seas, in land, yun. So before, it was only one, this one. Now there are a lot. So there is this emphasis on sustainable development. So 17 goals, 231 indicators. No? Nag-balloon even the indicators and the targets, no? that they wanted to countries to measure their progress on. Mas malaki yung demand for countries. Any comments on that? What do you see are the benefits of having these goals, the SDGs? And what are the negatives? What do you guys think? What are the pros and cons?
I feel like it's good to have these sort of goals kasi parang without like a physical copy of or physical layout of the goals, governments would just have, these ideas at the back of their minds, like, oh yeah, maybe we should do this. But then if it's laid out for them, like a nice visual copy, like they will actually have some concrete, like visual to go back to all the time.
Okay, thanks, Amaya. Anyone else? Sophia.
Hi, sir. Can you hear me po?
Yeah.
Okay. So for me naman po, like what Amaya said, I think having these goals in place sets a direction for all countries in the world because without it allows them to understand that the actions and the strategies that they employ now within their country is something that is in pursuit of these goals. So it sets direction for what the future is going to look like for each country.
Okay,
And
thanks, Sophia.
as
Go
for
ahead, sige.
cons naman po, I think when we fail to meet these goals, then that's something that could like unmotivate people, saying that these goals don't seem as realistic, especially for instance with the emergence of the pandemic and how that has affected the accomplishment of these goals. I think that's something that like would demotivate not just like the governments and all of the private sectors that are working on pursuing these goals, but also people as well in the everyday level trying to pursue them.
All right, thanks. Very useful points. I see one more person who raised her hand. Isabel?
Sir, sorry. I think Sophia touched on what I was going to mention about the cons.
No problem.
Yeah.
No problem. 2 more participants. Very interactive group. Okay. Sophie, Andrea.
Hello, sir. Can you hear me po?
Yes.
Ayun, what I think about the sustainable development goals is I appreciate that it's easy to understand, like it's inclusive for everyone, even those who are not super knowledgeable about these technical terms. But I'm also concerned because I'm not sure if the measurement, like if n- kino-communicate sa mga tao yung measurable key points or results for these goals to take place.
Yeah. Good point. Good point as well. All right. Anyone else? Mukhang, yeah, okay naman yun, no? Thanks to all the women, no? Walang male na nagsalita, no? Talking about goal number 5, gender equality. Thanks to the women who responded to the call, no? Very good, no? Again, the pros really are, it's well, one is, as mentioned, no, it's easy to understand kasi kita mo naman, and it's visual, people can easily understand what they mean, and it sort of gives countries like a road, or sort of a high level roadmap, no, of what you should prioritize. The cons naman, aside from what was mentioned na para, oh, it might be, I heard the term unrealistic, no? The problem, many people who criticize the SDGs is, yes, these are all important, but the problem is because there are too many now, it becomes so broad, it's too many, not just the goals, but the individual dimensions. May sub kasi yan eh, sub dimensions. It becomes too hard, especially for poorer countries, in terms of prioritization. Kasi sabihin mo lahat yan, priority, then it's so hard, no? For especially for poor countries to keep up and really prioritize all of these from 8 to 17 goals and 231 indicators. So that's the main criticism. Parang it became like a catch-all umbrella, no? And there is that reporting burden pa sa countries, no? Imagine NEDA and the Philippine Statistical Authority, which is under NEDA, has to monitor regularly all of these 231. So meron ding burden. But I agree with most of you that you're saying it's good that you know, at least it makes countries aware that these are supposed to be the goalposts. So there are pros and cons. Thanks for that. Ayan, so some SDG trends, and this is before the pandemic. I'm pretty sure that, you know, most of these actually probably deteriorated during the pandemic. So, yeah, so even before, no, quality education was deteriorating, life on land, no, biodiversity, a lot of stagnating things. No. Later we'll go through the sub areas, no. But based on what I've seen last Sunday, no, I did some sort of a word count. Surprisingly, no, even in the past, no, many students chose education, no, as stagnating or deteriorating. Pero in your case, no, many of you actually chose life on land and clean energy. So this class is kind of unique. No? The size is based on the frequency. No? So I subjected it to a word cloud of some sort. So very interesting. And this basically this chart agrees with your findings. No? And these are just to go through some of the details. No, these are really the problematic areas, no, that we see in the Philippines pre-pandemic. So all the more during the pandemic. So hunger, stunting, wasting, and this becomes problematic because many economists, the like of Dr. Shel Habito, who's one of the most famous Ateneo faculty members, has been saying, no, the problem with malnutrition is it affects brain power. So dehado agad. Yung mga poor kids who are malnourished, dehado agad sa buhay. They're at a disadvantage when they grow older because their mental capacity will shrink, no? Or has already shrunk. So limited agad. So that's really a problem. Health also is becoming a problem. More relevant for you guys is teenage pregnancy. That's becoming an alarming phenomenon, no? In the country. No? As early as 12 years old, mga ganon, that's becoming more common. Teens. Education, as you guys mentioned, enrollment. And now, no, during the pandemic, it's not just enrollment, but the quality of education, no? Especially in the public school system, where sometimes the onus or the burden is on the parents, and sometimes the parents can't even teach their kids. Energy, obviously, globally, and even the Philippine CO2 emissions. Financial inclusion, that's another thing. Financial inclusion only means, no, but this has improved, no. This just means families having an access to financial accounts like bank accounts, etc., etc. But actually, during the pandemic, this actually improved. Innovation in infra, the proxy for this is publications. No? So the more patents, publications a country has, the more they can attract more investment, they can be more productive. Cities, obviously, you have deteriorating cities like Metro Manila, Cebu is following the following Manila in terms of congestion, etc. Biodiversity, no, taking care of the environment, both of these are down. No? And corruption and security, no, that has been an age-old problem in the Philippines. Some may argue that it has gotten worse in the last 10 years or 5 years or so. All right. So based on what I've read, no, and I enjoy reading your answers in the discussion board. No? Thank you for your inputs there. No, just a note on critiquing before I leave this topic. No, whenever you answer discussion boards or whenever you say something, be specific. Make sure it's backed up by data. Wag yung tipong kasi gobyerno mali ganun. So be specific. Which agency? What did they do wrong? And back it up with data. And be open to different viewpoints. No? Yun lang. No? And read the news also, no? But avoid reading only one source. No? Be wary of news outlets that are clearly biased for or clearly biased against the government. I'm not saying stop reading what you're reading, no? All I'm saying is be open to other publications. So ito lang, just to be more specific, the pro-government, pro-Duterte outfits are the Daily Tribune and Manila Times. The clearly anti-Duterte outfits are Rappler and the Philippine Daily Inquirer. I'm not saying if you're reading these, I'm not saying stop, but also open your minds and your eyes to other publications. My preference, if you ask me, what are some of the more less sensationalist and more objective ones? Manila Bulletin, Philippine Star, and Business World. Those are my top three go-tos. Manila Bulletin, you can fall asleep while you're reading it. It's boring. But it's boring because it's objective. Hindi siya sensationalist like some of the mainstream media, other mainstream media outlets. And think, assess, and ask critically. No? If you see something na parang, validate, no? And ask questions. And lastly, no, since you guys are students, I've had my fair share of rebellious moments when I was in college or even high school. Let's try to avoid romanticizing dissent, no? And go beyond protests. I've had my fair share of protests. I'm not saying it's wrong. All I'm saying is go beyond protest. No? Write a policy paper, write position papers, read more, and protest if you want to. Because that has a role in any democratic society. I'm not saying it's wrong again, but you go beyond that. Some people, not me, are arguing protesting is actually not that difficult. It's actually sitting down, let's say, working for government, being a good worker in government, that's harder, or writing position papers. All I'm saying is, don't romanticize dissent. It's not just cool just to rebel against whatever, school, government, or something. Do more than just protest if you want to say something. Just some notes there. All right. Now we go to the development impacts of COVID. Here, we see three things, no? And this is in Canvas as well. No? COVID really hit us hard. No? Speaking of SDGs, no, as I mentioned, no, many of these would have probably further deteriorated. But here are some. Unemployment. And obviously, unemployment has implications on income. The unemployment rate pre-pandemic used to hover around 5%, give or take. In 2020, because they used to measure this quarterly, no? Ngayon, it's now monthly, which is better kasi more frequent for government's action. 17.6% from a low of 5 or 6%. Grabe. So it really spiked. That was at the height of the ECQ, no? This was in April or so. And obviously, you would expect hunger has doubled, no? Based on social weather stations surveys. And likely reversing the country's poverty trajectory. Here, look at this slide now. The problem with our official poverty statistics, and this is also true in other developing countries, they measure poverty in terms of monetary terms. No, we will get to that in module 2. Every 3 years lang. Not as frequent as we would like to. So the last time they measured it is 2018, then 2015, 2018. The next will be this year. So walang figures during the pandemic 2020. So statisticians had to do with just running simulations, what could have probably happened. So all of them consensus, poverty went up. We'll go through module 2 later, no? You see, no, before the pandemic, the trajectory of poverty in our country was actually getting better. It was going down. They were thinking it probably spiked up against during the pandemic. So here, no, some simulations lang. During COVID, no, they were predicting, no, kasi yung poverty natin was roughly around 21%. Let's put it that way. It could have gone. There are two kinds, no. There's poverty incidence percent, no, among families or among population. Iba-ibang unit of analysis. So they were saying in both cases, no, poverty among families or among population individuals likely went up, no, by 1.6%. Sabi nga nila, if without the ayuda, could have gone even higher by 5.8 or 6 percentage points. Ito, SAP, no, yung ayuda natin, same with population, no, poverty likely went up by around 3%, almost 3%. May SAP na yun, may ayuda na yun. And 3%, people will say, 3% na naman. But we are a population of 100 plus million. So 3% is actually at least 3 million Filipinos plunging back to poverty. So the simulations weren't good. So a lot of, deterioration. And speaking of the SDGs, I saw this just last August, no? The ADB released a publication basically saying the pandemic pushed an estimated 75 to 80 million people back to poverty in 2020. So ayan, progress has stalled, sabi nga nila, in areas such as hunger, health, and education. And this is true for Asia and Pacific. So ASEAN countries, including Pacific Islands. The economy was in shambles, no? Last year. We were growing on an average. So again, if you're not super familiar with the terms GDP, etc., think of GDP just as the country's income or a household's income or a pie, if you want. The pie getting bigger, more wealth. No? So we were growing. No? The pie or the income was growing on average 6% a year. So yung kunyari household dyan, no? 100,000 ang kita mo. So every year you were earning 100,000, 106,000, 100, let's say 13,000, etc., etc. It was growing. Then it contracted. The pie, instead of getting bigger, which is important, became smaller. So less for everybody. So 2020, the pie shrunk by almost 10%. So imagine if a household's income is 100,000, for example, and it shrunk by 10%, that's a cut of 10,000 pesos. That's big. That's really big. So that's the entire economy. No? So they were saying, no, if you scan across the different sectors, no, it's really worse for some. Some benefited, no. Pero let's say for those what we call sometimes as the experience economy, no, sectors, no. Restaurants, hotels, tourism industry really shrunk by almost half. Economic output activity shrunk. So imagine if they were earning, if they're a household, no, earning 100,000, that entire sector only grew by 50,000. Talagang nag-shrink. Whereas some gained, no? Obviously, ICT grew by 5%. Banking services obviously grew a lot, and public spending as well. Diba? ICT kasi everyone tried to get whatever, no, mobile data or fixed data. Diba? Ito naman on the right hand side, you'll see, no, ADB and World Bank did some surveys. What they were saying basically was, ito, for example, no, arts and entertainment, all sectors, no, either at least 50%, 56% of all industries either temporarily closed or permanently closed. Tingnan nyo yung arts and entertainment and tourism. As high as 80% either temporarily or permanently closed. Same with tourism. Permanently closed, 21%. Imagine mo, 1 out of 5 tourism establishments permanently closed. That's how dire the impact of COVID was in the Philippines. All right. So enough about the depressing figures, no? Let's now be optimistic naman. No? So what do we do? You guys are management students. And I'm sure, no, some of you, your dream is to create your own businesses, be like in Japsia or be the next Mang Inasal, whatever. Create your own business, no? Be in the private sector or work for very prestigious company, corporations, San Miguel, Ayala, etc., etc. So I wanted this to include this discussion. We'll talk about this more in Module 5. But I wanted just to introduce this concept. Kasi again, when people think about sustainable development goals, development in general, they always think, hindi, trabaho ni Duterte yan or trabaho ng gobyerno yan. Whether that's Duterte or the previous administration, that's within the domain of or yung mga NGOs yan. But I am now making the argument, and this is becoming more popular now. No, this concept is becoming more popular. The private sector has a role in addressing development challenges for the SDGs. So just to put everything into context, no, before kasi in the 1960s, sinasabi nila, maliit pa lang yung mga private sector. They were still growing. But come 2016, no, 50 plus years after, private capital accounts for 84% of financial flows, no, going to developing countries. So itong chart din na to, for example, you have, let me just see, you have a lot of domestic private sector and international private sector accounting for trillions of dollars. So what does this tell you? Basically, they have resources. It's basic, no? You have the likes of the big corporations. No, Ramon Ang, for example, no? Just to cite Ramon Ang as an example. Because he had a lot of, he had resources at his disposal, they came out with a lot of support to the public during the pandemic. And it's not just financial resources. No? So let's go through these bullets. No? So, yun nga, sinasabi nila, the SDGs all need, all hands on deck. You need all sectors to contribute. No? So sabi nga nila, UNCTAD, which is a UN agency, they estimate that the aggregate number of resources that the world needs to achieve SDGs is 3 to 4.5 trillion. It's big. So governments cannot afford that by themselves. And there's growing consensus that government and NGO philanthropic resources are not enough. And this brings me to my point, no? The private sector, yes, they provide and they have financial resources, but it's not the only resource that they bring to the table. They are beneficial, and we look to them because the private sector brings expertise, technology, innovation, and they can move faster. No? They have this rigor and discipline. Ito, for example, the vaccines. The vaccines, Pfizer in the US, for example, Pfizer, BioNTech, and Moderna, they're not government. It's not just because they had the financial resource, they had expertise. So sometimes it's the private sector who has the technology that we need to leverage so we can actually address development challenges. Now in Module 5, we'll go through a sampling of some of the industries where you can combine making profit, and profit is not inherently bad, no? Where you can combine profit while at the same time trying to address a development challenge. Let me emphasize that. Profit is not bad inherently, especially if it sustains your business and you're doing good. So yun nga, sometimes there is also profit to be made in investing in things that actually help address or respond to the SDG goals. You guys are very familiar with this. Very inspiring. Very, very inspiring yung community pantry that started in Maginhawa. Tapos para siyang, alam niyo naman mga Pinoy, di ba? Ang mga Pinoy mahilig magkopyahan yan. So, di ba? The likes of the milk tea phenomenon, no? Biglang magsisprout na lang everywhere. Same thing with community pantries, di ba? It's good. Ako, I got inspired. I also contributed to some, no? In my area, I live in the Scout area. So, hindi Maginhawa, but other pantries. The problem, not problem, but the issue with philanthropy is, it is good. There really is a role for it. But the problem with, or the issue with philanthropy or volunteerism is, it's good, but it is at the mercy of volunteers and donors. Which begs the question on sustainability. Not the environmental kind, no? Pero can it be sustained? Kasi once the donors, the pool of donors or gifts dry up, it will fall. So in many cases, actually, if there is a profit, kaya nga nauso na yung concept of social enterprises, having a business model where there's some profit, we're not saying super large profits, but if there's profit to be made, it's better because your profit, you can keep on doing good if you're targeting the good stuff. Kasi, it ensures sustainability. I wanted to inculcate this point to you guys because you guys are management students. So I'm not saying, kasi ako, sorry, to be honest with you guys, I'm now a convert, no? Especially Module 5, we'll revisit this. Dati kasi, during college days, parang, there's that tendency na yung corporate world, that's evil, ganyan. But no, especially if you're trying to do good, no, it actually makes sense. It can be a more powerful tool even, I would argue. So remember this point, we'll revisit this in Module 5, talking about the role of the private sector, corporations, companies in addressing SDGs. Ito, just as an example, I'm not saying galing ng Ayala, no? But I just found this in their website before, no? I don't think they have this up. No? I used this last year. No? When I was browsing materials, pictures for my class, this came up. Parang, uy, galing no, Ayala, some time ago, sabi nila, they really want to be a force for good. So what they did actually was to see how their different business units, kasi conglomerate ang Ayala, how their different business units can respond to the SDG goals. And they tried to map it out. I'm not, of course, at face value, parang, uy, ang galing, no? But of course, I cannot assess whether they're really doing good in this area. But it's a good exercise, no? And it sort of it reinforces my point that no, business can be a force for good. And remember, no, kunyari, no, for example, itong kanilang, they started a low-cost quality education outfit called AC Education, no? Yung mga ACE schools. No? Imagine if they keep making profit, a little bit of profit, then they can continue doing what they're doing. Kasi hindi na ubos yung resource. Diba? Whereas if it's just giving money all the time without anything in return, maubos yun. It will get depleted. So yun, ang galing ng ginawa niya. They mapped it out. Again, at face value, it seems good, no? But I can't vouch for them, no? For all of these different units. So they're saying, oh, our energy team, no, let's go into renewables. Meron na rin silang renewable energy to address SDG goal number 7. Sustainable communities, ayan, Ayala Land, etc., etc. So yun, meron na rin daw silang low-cost health clinics, etc. So they're making money. It's not doing good just for the sake of doing good, but it's also generating profit. So it's a win-win. So this is just an example of the possibilities out there. All right. Did anyone get a chance to finish the last video of Module 1? I just wanted to hear your thoughts about what you, without necessarily referring to the bullets in the deck, no, in the slide. If you've gone through the last video, no, the TED Talk video in Module 1, what do you think of it? I think the title was Do Not Pity the Poor. Any thoughts on that? Any thoughts on the video?
Sir,
Go ahead. Sige, Gab.
yeah, I kind of liked it because well, it kind of puts perspective then, like the people you're trying to help are actually like real people and not just like what is this? Like it's trying to avoid the whole poverty porn kind of situation. Like you're trying to reel people in by telling people na, hey, these people live a really terrible life, and you know, it's your job to to save them or something. And like what is it? It's like, well, if you donate $1, you're already saving a child in Africa or whatever. It kind of like cheapens their lives. Like and also like one line that I remember from the video was like you're the cost of helping these people, like the cost to them is like their dignity. Yeah, so I kind of like that line.
Perfect, no, perfect. And that's what I wanted to impart to you guys at the end of Module 1. It's like, kasi it's but natural, no? We all keep learning about what are the kinds of hardships that people go through in Module 1. There's this tendency for people to be like, ay, kawawa naman sila. Especially when you see someone who's poor. No? It's but natural, obviously, to have pity. Kasi kawawa naman talaga. But the point of the video is it's not to not have pity, but don't stop there. Do not, maawa ka, but do not see them as helpless. Medyo iba yun. Because whoever it is, no, poor, not poor, whoever it is, no, they have resources, they have assets. I like your point about poverty porn kasi a lot of NGOs actually do that, no? Yung especially yung mga child in Africa. So that's really what I wanted you guys to avoid, no? Let's avoid that donor ako, you're just a beneficiary. The problem with that, no, inherently okay naman kasi they really need something if you think about it. Pero once you have that paradigm that, I will save you, kaya nga I don't want that mentality, it may create a power imbalance whether you're consciously thinking about it or not. Kasi subconsciously, you might think about it. So the problem is, then it cascades into, and subconsciously you're thinking, that person is less than me. Which is bad. Which is bad. So yun ang sinasabi ko. Don't pity them. Again, I like the video. Hopefully, most of you like the video. So the better paradigm is, okay, they are poor. How do we help them help themselves? How do we empower them? And this is true for your NSTP classes. How do we empower and use what they have? Kasi everyone, I would argue, you go to urban poor communities, actually they would be the first ones to offer you something. Very hospitable. So, and people have their own networks, their own assets. No? So how do we, the question here is, how do you empower them to use what they have, even if it's meager resources? How do we develop solutions that go beyond donors? So we'll learn more from this class, from Module 2 and even Module 3. Module 3, I think. So to close Module 1, I like to end with this cartoon all the time. And this is now a caveat in terms of enabling them to empower themselves. For the guys out there, or even the women, some of you may have gone to senior high in Ateneo already. Who took up tulong-dulong among the guys or even women? Marco. So remember, a couple of you. So remember, I told you that I did JVP. I was assigned in Zamboanga. After I came back, before I joined government, a long time ago, I actually taught tulong-dulong. I was a substitute teacher kasi I was still looking for a more permanent job. So sige, hanap muna dito. So I was a substitute teacher for Meng Digia, si Miss Meng Digia. So at that time, so 3 months lang. Tapos nung bumalik na siya, they offered to have me teach morality. Parang sabi ko, I don't think I'm a saint, so I might not be able to teach that. Pero one of the things that we emphasize in tulong-dulong is this cartoon. The first two at least. Alam niyo na naman what this means, di ba? Parang, all of you have heard this. No? If you give a man a fish or a woman, or a family na lang to be more gender neutral, if you give a family a fish, that family will eat for a day. No? The second is all about, even better, kasi ito yung pitying the poor and being messianic. Ito, teach the family or the household head of that family how to fish. They can feed forever or regularly. So enabling, yan yung sinasabi natin enabling part. But going now to Module 2 as an intro, teka muna, is it really fishing that is the solution to the problem? So for example, you have this mindset of fishing. Let's teach fishing to all the urban poor communities. What if you go to Baguio? Will teaching the urban poor communities in Baguio how to fish solve their problems? Probably not. Where the hell will they fish? Diba? So Module 2 is all about, yes, now Module 1 is focusing on the problems in general. Module 2 is now all about being more precise in defining the problem so that eventually you can maybe start thinking about more appropriate solutions that will empower them. And that's your homework That's actually homework. Given data for a particular city or municipality, diagnose their issues. What interventions can you take? So that's module 2. All right. So we will now transfer to module 2, part 1. The first, we won't finish module 2 this evening. Let me just pull up the other deck. Wait lang, feel free if you have questions now while I'm pulling up the slide. Share screen. Okay. All right. So module 2. So tonight is all about income-based measure of poverty. We'll discuss non-income next week. Then we'll do module 3 the following week. Laser point. Okay. All right. So when we measure poverty and well-being in general, no? So module 1 again is all about describing the problems. So module 2 is measuring them. Because sabi nga nila, management gurus will always tell you, you cannot manage what you cannot measure. Parang doctor yan, di ba? The paradigm we want for module 2 is think of the class as a class of doctors. Diba? It's important for you to diagnose the problem specifically. Not, ay, may problema siya. No? Di ba, doctor mo pag, mataas BP, or ano pa ba, mataas yung CBC, di ba? The doctor will ask your parents to do all sorts of tests, no, to find out the problem. So ganun din tayo. No? We come up with different measures, no, to correctly diagnose the problem, not just because we want to diagnose the problem, but to ultimately find solutions. So this evening, measurements are now categorized into 2 buckets. No? One is income-based, meaning it's measured by money, how much you earn, how much you consume. The other is non-income. That talks about access to health, education, the other SDG goals. So we'll talk about 4 things now: poverty incidence ratio, inequality, interrelationships between poverty, inequality, and the pie, the economic growth. And then we'll talk about a particular important topic, which is vulnerability, which has become more important or more relevant during the pandemic. All right. So first, we'll discuss things about poverty lines, etc. All right. I hope some of you have started module 2. No? First, the technical piece, no, in terms of poverty measurement. There are 2 lines here. No? So this is the income, and this is these are lines. So you see 2 lines here: the poverty line and the subsistence line. So let's discuss poverty line first. And the subsistence na lang. Poverty line, sorry. So this is basically the amount of money a family or a person. Kasi yun nga, it's 2 kinds of poverty measures. One is for households, one is for individuals. So 2 sets of statistics. So the poverty line is basically just the amount of money a person or a family would need not to be considered poor. So what that means is everyone earning incomes below that line, below this line, are what we call poor, officially classified as poor. Everyone else above is non-poor, obviously. Then there's a special category, those who are near the poverty line, those who are just above, for lack of a better term, near poor, but that's an official term that statisticians use. There's another line, what we call the subsistence line. Kasi ito kasi, It's the amount of money that a person needs to meet all bare necessities, not just food. Food plus plus. This other line is just all about food. It's the amount of money that a person or a family would need. It's that level, no, that a person or family would need not to be considered food poor or to meet the very basic food requirements. So everyone under this, earning incomes under this, are what we call food poor. Kasi they don't even have enough income to satisfy their food requirements, more so yung iba. That's why it's a lower threshold. It's just all about meeting food requirements. So they're sometimes called food extreme poor. That's a more special or specific kind of poor, no? Talagang walang-wala, even food requirements. So poverty rate is just the percent. No, it's just it's all the same thing. No, when you hear in the literature, development literature, poverty rate, incidence, ratio, head count, it all means the same thing. It's the same banana. It's just the percentage or the proportion of poor people, those under this, divided by the total population. So it's a percentage of the poor to the total population. Could be population, meaning all individuals, or could be households, all households. Subsistence naman, obviously, as you would expect, no, is the proportion of the food poor, those belonging with incomes below this line, divided by the total population. Proportion of food poor to the total Philippine population or total Philippine number of Philippine households. Magnitude is just the number. So for example, if we had 20% Filipinos who are poor, then you would expect roughly around 20 million Filipinos are poor. The incidence ratio head count rate is a percent. The magnitude is the actual number. Counting na yun. Right. So that's the technical part. There's a Rappler article written by one of the more well-known poverty statisticians in the Philippines. No? Si Jose Raman Albert, Toots ang tawag namin kay Toots. Toots Albert. All right. So ito, no, the trend was improving since before. Sabi ko sa inyo, di ba, the statistics, official income-based poverty statistics are measured every 3 years. So kita nyo, pre-pandemic, we were really doing great. Imagine nyo, a very big reduction from 2015 to 2018. All praises, no? People were all praises both for the Aquino administration and the Duterte administration for really reducing poverty. But yun nga, the problem is the pandemic threw off this trend. Na-discourage. So ito, no, just to provide more recent statistics, among the population, poverty incidence versus subsistence incidence. Kasi nga, di ba, you would expect the number and the of food poor to be less naman than the percent of the general poor. Di ba? Kasi food poor is those who don't even have enough income to meet food needs. So both of them we were doing great as a country. Imagine you almost na half yung subsistence incidence in 3 years' time, which is quite significant. And when we talk about 1 percentage point in the Philippines, remember, we are more than 100 million Filipinos. So that means for every 1% reduction, that's lifting 1 million Filipinos out of poverty. So malaki ang 1%. All right. Question now. It's an icebreaker. Baka nabobore na kayo with the technical stuff. This can be mathematical, but there is logic to this. No? Which one is higher? No? And the answer is the same for each. Which one is higher? Poverty incidence among individuals, no? Among the 100 plus individuals, or among the households, no? Meaning the 20. If it's a percent of the total population or if it's a percent of the total number of households. Which one is higher? Whether it's poverty incidence or subsistence incidence. And why? Take a wild guess. There's logic to this. Anyone? Oops. Anyone? And why? Any takers? Guess lang, guess lang. O yung guys naman, kasi medyo, sige, sige, go ahead, Sophia. That's fine, no worries, no worries. I was gonna challenge the guys, kasi kanina pa yung mga girls. Sige, Sophia, go ahead.
Sir, I think poverty incidence among the population is higher. Oh wait, what's the question, sir? Among individuals or families?
Yes. Kumbaga, a percent of the 100 million Filipinos or a percent of the total number of households?
I think probably the population in terms of individuals, just because coming up with an estimation for that would probably be easier than the household.
Sige. Anyone else?
Just my guess, sir.
No worries, no worries, no worries. I mean, sige. So let's see the answer. So if you see the graph, no, you're right, no, it's higher, but there is logic to this. In terms of population, the Philippines in 2018, 16.6% of the 100 million Filipinos were poor. 100 plus. In terms of families, no, 12.1% of Filipinos were Filipino households, no, were poor. Of the, I would imagine, mga 20 million households. It's mathematical because they found out that the poor and the lower income populations have larger family sizes. So do the math. So for example, if you're just counting in terms of all the individuals, there's this one household, no? Let's say a poor household. They're composed of 8 people. So that's 8 poor people versus a non-poor family, that's 4. That's 4 non-poor people. Pero what happens if you count them each, no, as family units? So the 8 becomes 1, the 4 becomes 1. So nabubury, no, in terms of family units yung poverty. Because nga they found out that the poorer families, the lower income families, actually are poorer. So nade-deflate yung mga 8, yung mga 7, 6 large family, poor family sizes are counted as 1, while the non-poor who tend to be mas konti are also counted as 1. So medyo na natatago, so to speak. We'll get to this more in module 4, no, when we talk about population and reproductive health. All right. So, ito. So, we were talking about lines, no? Thresholds. No? And I always like this portion kasi I want to gauge your answers here, your thoughts on this. Kasi kanina, abstract tayo, di ba? You have a line, ganyan-ganyan, that's set by the government, ganyan-ganyan. Ito naman, what are the actual costs? What are the actual lines? No? Mind you, these are average. No? May differences yan depending where you are. Kasi cost of living, mas mura sa probinsya than Manila. So the poverty line, no, they were saying in 2018, no, was 2,145 per person per month, which is basically 500 pesos per week for one person to be considered no longer poor, to not be considered poor. So you can't even buy, I'm sure some of your your swell, your baon are probably could be higher. No? So you can't even afford the Starbucks every day. For some of you who like going to Starbucks. I don't personally. I like more local beans. So ito. So sinasabi nila, a person needs less than 100 pesos per day not to be considered poor. Then, they're saying the food threshold naman, no? You only need roughly 50 pesos per day na kasi per month. 50 pesos per day not to be considered poor. Food poor pala. You can meet your food requirements already by that. The same thing with international poverty. Kasi these two things are, two bullets are official Philippine government poverty lines. There are also what we call international poverty lines, and they differ by country. The official international poverty line is $1.90. That is not US dollar. No? It's called purchasing power parity. You don't have to remember this, no? But the equivalent is roughly, in the Philippines, the equivalent is roughly 37.24 pesos to not be considered poor. Ang PPP lang naman is, yes, it's not US dollar, but it's also the frame of reference is the cost of goods in the US. So for example, the key to remembering PPP, no, purchasing power parities, for example, itong $1.90, what can you buy in the US for $1.90? So for example, that's a bottle of mineral water. So that bottle of mineral water, you then find a bottle of mineral water in the Philippines. How much does that cost? So that's now the equivalent purchasing power parity in the Philippines. Kaya hindi siya US exchange rate. It's what would $1.90 get you in the States, and what will that cost in the local country? So my question to you now, no, given these poverty lines, believable ba? What do you think? 2,145 per month, you're no longer considered poor. 1,500 per month, you're no longer considered food deficient, or you can already satisfy your minimum food requirement. Tingin nyo, Gab.
Sure. One problem I think about with the poverty line and thing and stuff is like, it kind of assumes that people will spend the money on food first. Like, I don't think that's the main focus for a lot of people.
That's a good point as well. No? But assuming that they will try to meet their basic needs, hindi pang-iinom lang. Sorry, I saw Marian raising her hand as well. But that's a good point.
I think it's believable naman, just in a sense that it's enough to buy you food, but is it really living? And I think another issue of this is like, this takes the Philippines as a whole, but then the standard of living in different places are like completely different. Like Manila is considered to be one of the most expensive places to live in. So I guess if you're gonna give us this amount for someone who's poor here, they're gonna suffer a lot more than someone who's living in the countryside.
That's a good point. But just to clarify, these figures are national averages. But you're right, no, the Philippines has different poverty lines for each region or province pa nga. Yeah, so you're right, no, you're absolutely right. Some were arguing for a national line, pero mali yun. Because you're absolutely correct, no. If you use that barometer, you might be poor in Manila, but not poor in. But it differs. In fairness to the government. So I'm actually surprised, no, with this group, kasi some people, no, most students would say, no, sir, grabe yan, that's too low, that's too low. Let's go to the next slide, no, to further investigate. it may sound unbelievable to some, no? Kasi imagine mo ito, no? 2,145 per month, no? You get food and non-food requirements already there. It may sound unbelievable to many people, maybe except you guys. But the thing is, it's quote unquote credible, meaning there is basis naman for establishing these amounts. And I know when I was still working in government, matagal na akong umalis din. I worked for 5 years. I was part of an interagency team that was coming up with these methodologies, no, for coming up with these very technical poverty measurements. So may basis, and I can vouch for that. I can even vouch for the credibility of the Philippine Statistics Authority. They are credible. They have one of the best cadre of statisticians in the country. So there are multiple steps in actually coming up with the line. It's not necessarily rocket science, but it's not super straightforward as well. It's not as easy as it seems. They put a lot of thought into this. We did, no, during my time, put a lot of thought into this. And many countries follow the same format. So the poverty line is composed of two categories, no? Food, the food part, no, and the non-food part. Simple lang naman, di ba? You can, no, the problem with the non-food component is if you ask everybody, we will not agree on what the other non-food basic necessities are. Diba? Mahirap yun. You get a survey, you'll have different answers. What you can directly measure is the dietary needs. So what PSA does is they directly estimate what a household or a person would need, no, for each meal and per day even. So, you know, they have, the Philippine government has this agency called FNRI, the Food and Nutrition Research Institute, that sort of stipulates now for a healthy person, you have to have 1,800 calories, 100% of this vitamin, etc. So they actually take that into account. Each province, they create food menus per family, and they directly, low cost, obviously, very low cost, they compute that. So they directly compute the cost of that. Now comes the harder part, as I was saying, the non-food component. No? So how do you estimate the amount of non-food needs? Diba? How? Diba? Kasi nga, magkakaiba tayo. So what they do is, it's measured indirectly as a ratio of food expenditure. So what they do, as an example, pero this is how they do it. I'm just throwing some figures here, no? But this is basically how they do it. So they first examine the consumption patterns, no, of a set group. Let's say the lowest 30% income group in the country. Kasi you can divide the Philippine population into poorest 10%, poorest 30%, etc., or richest 10% or whatnot. So what they do is, they observe, no, for example, the ratio of food consumption of the lowest 30% is 2/3 of their overall budget or costs. No? Then yan ang gamitin natin to establish the poverty line. So, for example, the food cost is 5,000 to simplify things. No? And they see that 5,000 represents 2/3 of a household spending. Then, mathematically speaking, 2/5 yung other basic needs. Given consumption patterns. Kasi 5,000 divided by X equals 2/3. 2/3 represents the food cost. The other 1/3 naman represents the non-food cost. That's how they do it. If you're a bit confused, please let me know, or you can refer to the Rappler article. So it's really examining the consumption patterns of the lowest 30% income. So you can do the math, no? 5,000 divided by X, for example, equals 2/3. So kunyari, 2/3 nga yung spending ng poor on food, the 1/3 is the other, basically. So kung 5,000 yung food line mo, 7,500 yung poverty line. So that's how they establish it. Indirectly, yung other basic necessities. So there is credibility naman. But the problem is, and I always emphasize this, it may sound unbelievable because this really is the bare minimum. Parang survival. It doesn't mean you meet the poverty line or you're just above the poverty line. You're well off na. No. It just means that you are barely surviving or you're barely meeting your minimum needs. Maraming argument dito eh. Is it too low? Is it too high? Ganun. Daming argument. But the bottom line is you need some sort of measure, di ba? You cannot manage what you cannot measure. And that's why we want to measure this. Or at least create some sort of a trend line. You see whether it's going up, going down. So this is how the thresholds are determined. And then they go around the country, they administer this survey called FIES. All right. Just let me know if you have questions. Huh? Here's another debate among statisticians who are measuring poverty. Kasi the way we've done it as a country in the Philippines, you've always relied on income. No? How much income should you need to not be considered poor or to be considered poor? May mga countries that are using consumption. No? How much are you consuming naman? How much should you consume, no? For you to be considered poor or not poor? Here's a very, actually, it looks complicated, pero it's not actually. Many statisticians, in theory, support a consumption approach versus an income approach. Assessing your well-being in terms of how much you earn or how much or the total cost of your consumption, the expenditure/consumption approach. It all boils down to consumption smoothing. Ganda ng term eh. Actually, when I first came across this term, parang what? Kasi academics, statisticians like to come up with fancy terms. So even consumption smoothing. But it sounds highly technical, but it's a very simple concept. So ito lang yon, the graph. Look at the graph. What it's basically saying, the problem with income is that for many people, income is not constant. Sometimes income is seasonal, especially in the rural side, no, farmers. And right now, mga gig economy workers, no, Grab drivers or mga rumaraket, no, mga home-based racketeers, as we call them. Ano yan? Their income is not steady. Pero the argument is income may not be steady, but consumption is more or less, no, a household consumes, no, their consumption patterns are more or less the same. Hindi yan masyado nagva-vary. So gusto nila, consumption na lang tayo. Kasi a family, whether you have money now, will try to borrow or do whatever so they can consume at their usual consumption trend. So pwedeng at one point mababa income, they will borrow money, and then when they have money, they will now start saving and pay off the loans, and then pag wala na namang harvest, then low income, they borrow again or use their savings. But so income may be going up and down, but consumption more or less stays constant. Kaya consumption smoothing. Usually it's smooth. It's constant. That's why many statisticians are saying, oh, let's just use the consumption approach now. Measure people's well-being in terms of how the cost of what they consume. Kasi that's a better predictor of well-being. Oo nga naman, think about it. Kasi uh, what people are able to get or buy, that's a better measure rather than what people are earning. Kasi nga, baka it's not constant. So that's still a debate now. There are also some negatives, no? And some empirical difficulties when it comes to switching to consumption. Kaya the Philippines is still using income, but many are arguing consumption is more superior. So that's just a side lesson for you guys. Because there are some debates around some of these more technical measurement methodologies. All right, there's also this thing called self-rated poverty. I'm sure you guys have seen this, no? Also, yeah, very sensationalist when it comes to the news. No? What do you guys think of that? The SWS, no? Yun nga. So it's like a ano, it's a heart yung monitor, no? It sometimes goes up, goes down. In general, it has improved. No? What do you guys think of the self-rated poverty? If I may ask, what do you guys think of that? Isabel?
Sir, although it's subjective to those who are reporting themselves, I feel like it is still valid, especially since when we measure poverty, like how it's mentioned in the module, like it's multifaceted. So that means like it's not just the statistics and not just the numbers, but also like the human side of it, like how the people feel, they think that their life is and all that stuff. So yeah, I think it's relevant and it's something that should be taken into account, but also along with the statistics.
All right. Anyone else? All right. So again, you're absolutely correct. No? There is merit. There is merit in that. Some notes, no? It's higher usually than the official poverty statistics. Kanina, you saw it from 23 it became 18. Ito, if you see it, it's like 40 plus, almost 50. There are no computations involved. They basically just ask you, do you think you're poor or not? Yes or no. So no rigor. But there is use, no? The problem naman, when it comes to the negative, to the cons, the problem with that is it's very subjective because sometimes kasi you're saying that you're poor, pero hindi ka pala poor. You feel poor because your neighbor is richer than you. Some people would say, I only have a second-hand car. My neighbor has 5 cars, therefore I'm poor. So sometimes my subjectivity. No? But it's useful because it gives the society and the government a good feel for the people's pulse. So it usually follows national trends. Kung may pandemic, may crisis, you will expect no rice crisis, inflation is high, you would expect self-rated poverty to go up. So it's really good for pulse checking. And as you say, no, there's merit because if people feel they're poor, then it means they're not able to satisfy their needs. So there is merit in it. But just to compare both, no, there are differences. So, but the good thing here also is the frequency kasi every quarter meron si SWS. Whereas yung official poverty statistics every 3 years. So, hindi ko nga alam eh. We used to argue that at least at the national level, you should have data every year. Walang budget din. It's actually an expensive undertaking, no, to do surveys. Let's move to the next concept. So we're done with poverty. Now let's talk about inequality. That's the twin concept of poverty. And globally, the gold standard when it comes to inequality is what we call the Gini coefficient, developed by a person named something Gini. I don't know his first name. So you don't have to deal with the math. You can if you want to, but it's basically this guy based it on what he calls the Lorentz curve. You don't have to understand this graph really, but let's go to the measure itself. The measure is from 0 to 1. So mga decimal yan, 0.0 this, 0.2, 0.3. when a society's Gini coefficient is 0, it means everyone has the same amount of money. Everyone is equal. If it's number 1, one person owns pretty much everything. Most unequal. So 0 to 1. The closer you are to 0, the better. Philippines naman, we've been hovering above 0.42, 0.43 for something for the longest time, since maybe the early 2000s or even late 1990s. We have actually the highest Gini coefficient in Southeast Asia, which means we are the most unequal country in Southeast Asia. No surprises there. Just like in other countries, you see side by side the posh villages and outside are slum areas. So now, and there's this good video as well, no, from Dr. Ravallon, one of the gurus in terms of poverty estimation. He now tries to explain. No, I hope you get to see this if you haven't. Module 2. No, really a good video. No. It's short. The question now, so what is the relationship between poverty, inequality, and economic growth? Or is there? What are the interrelationships? How does one affect the other? Di ba nga, for one, no, di ba nga ang one of the goals that we want, not the only goal, no, but one of the important things a country wants is to keep growing the economy. Bigger pie. The theory is the bigger the pie, the more people can benefit from the larger pie. But what and this is proven by empirical studies, no statistical studies, if a country's Gini coefficient or if a country's income is highly unequal or unequally distributed, the poverty reducing potential impacts of larger pie or more superior, faster economic growth becomes less. It's more muted versus a country which is growing at the same rate but has a more equal distribution. Theoretically, it makes sense, di ba? Parang the pie gets bigger, pero it doesn't mean if the distribution is unequal, doesn't mean the additional benefits accrue equally to all. Pwedeng the richer get more of that bigger pie with crumbs going to the poor. So that's the first interrelationship. No? Everything else equal, you would expect larger pie or larger economy, everyone would benefit. But the poor benefit less if the society is unequal. They still benefit, but less than if the society was equal. On the flip side naman, let's examine what now is the relationship between poverty affecting economic growth. Kasi kanina, economic growth making an impact on poverty. Ngayon naman, let's do it in reverse. There is also an interrelationship, no? On the flip side as well. The more unequal society is, the harder it is for the poor to actually move up. Therefore, if you kunyari, move up meaning be better educated, be better nourished, what ends up happening, that poor person or the poor cannot be as productive as you want them to be. Therefore, they cannot contribute as much to the economy. So in both directions, inequality becomes a dampener. It dampens the effects of economic growth to poverty, and it inhibits the poor from further contributing to the country's economic prosperity. My question now to you guys is, so how do you make society more equal? Some thoughts. How do you make society more equal? Any thoughts? Kasi taas ng Gini natin, how do you make the genie smaller? How do you make income? Do you force people to have equal incomes? Ganun ba dapat or what? All right. Sige, makagutom na kayo eh. No, we don't want to give everyone the same income. That's wrong. That's a communist, very old school and wrong paradigm. You equalize opportunities for income. So that means focusing on health, focusing on equal access to education. Or you go to, let's say, European countries, the quality of public education is good. Sometimes as good as in the US also, no. Some states, no, they have really superior public school systems, no? And the rich actually have their kids go to public schools. So you equalize opportunities. You don't equalize what people earn, but equalize their potential. Let's put it that way. So we'll explore this in the non-income part and further in module 4. All right. Last 2 slides, I think. Okay. When talking about poverty, and this is especially relevant during the pandemic, I wanted also to explore a concept called vulnerability. Vulnerability is associated with those individuals or families who actually are sometimes poor, no? Well, let's put it this way. Are two statisticians like to further, for good reason, no? To further be more precise, no? When it comes to defining poverty. There's what we call chronic poverty, where a poor person, for example, is always poor. Kasi di ba they measure nga poverty every 3 years. No? So may mga families talagang palagi silang poor. But there are families or people who actually are poor in one side and then they become poor, then poor again. Diba? So most of the near poor, remember kanina sa poverty line, there's this group that's just above the poverty line. They're the near poor. No? Usually they're vulnerable. No? People, they only have bigger incomes when a disaster happens, they fall down to poverty. No? They fall back into poverty. So that's vulnerability for you. No? It doesn't mean that you're always poor, but because of the precarious nature of your income, it's not, you don't have any buffer, you are vulnerable. So many of the near poor are vulnerable. So meron to, no? I posted this also on Canvas, no? Dr. Celia Reyes, sorry, I forgot the S, no? May mga trend analysis, no? For some people who were never poor, transient poor, previously poor. So marami siyang and it's good, no? Kasi sometimes the interventions that government or society should do differ. That's why it's important. Yun yung sinasabi nga kanina. The reason why we come up with all these measures and sub-measures is because we want to develop appropriate interventions. So what do we do? So for the vulnerable, no, and based on past studies, no, some determinants of vulnerability, no, is for example, if you live in the provinces, in the rural sides, no, you may be vulnerable to falling into poverty if you live in an area where there's conflict, persistent conflict. That's another potential risk for vulnerability. If you're a member of the basic sectors. There's a law in the Philippines that was passed in the late 90s where basic sectors, the term was defined and coined even. It refers to official marginalized. So you have, there's 12 of them. Farmers, fisherfolk, urban poor, cooperatives, senior citizens, migrant workers, persons with disabilities, etc., etc. There's that long list. So if you're a member of that, you're also vulnerable. So what the previous studies have been emphasizing it's really the importance of safety nets. Kasi vulnerability is all about falling or the risk of falling back into poverty because you don't have buffers. So you need to put in place better buffers. So the likes of the SSS, GSIS, etc., safety nets that you tap, no, or you turn to for a rainy day, so to speak, whether that's literal or figurative. And resilience mechanisms. So, and they're saying also if you can uh, accumulate assets, no, whether that's physical assets or financial assets like savings, much better. Kaya nga, before, as an aside, when they introduced the concept of microfinance, they also started soon, no, started introducing micro savings. Kasi nga, they want the poor to continue build an asset base, whether that's financial or physical. The last thing, no? And you may want to remember this for your assignment number 2. How do you reduce both chronic and present poverty? The studies point to 5 important things. College education, that's a good way of at least avoiding chronic. Lower dependency burden, meaning don't have too many kids. Too many kids that you can afford. I actually married late, so I 5 gave birth almost 3 years ago. So we have a toddler here, and I so imagine some of the poor families, they have 5, 7, 10 kids even. So the more mouths you have to feed, obviously, the harder it is. Asset ownership, as I mentioned, employment, obviously, no, being in a job, and absence of armed conflict, especially for middle. All right. Any questions? I think that's the last slide. So I went over by 5 minutes. I thought I was going to be done in 1.5 hours. All right. And thank you to all of you for staying until the end. I think some dropped out, which is fine. I don't check attendance, but I hope you guys found this useful. Please continue finishing module 2 or start module 2 if you haven't. I know some of your subjects are challenging this semester, so I also hope you spend some time on this course as well. So I know I'm competing with the likes of Opman, which is fun. No, when I did my graduate studies, my favorite subject was Opman. I did that somewhere else, not in Ateneo. So I know I'm competing with other more technically rigorous subjects, but it's fun. No, everything should be fun for you guys. Everything is new learning for you. So any other questions before I let you go? Sige. Again, many thanks. You can shoot me an email if you have concerns or consultations, no, before you pass the October 2 assignment. All right. Have a good evening, guys. See you next week. Bye-bye.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.